Humans and chimpanzees are two different species that exist today. But as we know from looking at homologous structures and molecular data, humans and chimpanzees share a pretty recent common ancestor. What happened long ago to cause this common ancestor to diverge into two very different species? Well, that's a question we're going to explore today in our video on speciation. Let's start by defining speciation. Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. Speciation is the formation of a new species, and you often see speciation events on phylogenetic trees. Wherever there's a common ancestor that diverges into two new species, that is a speciation event. You might be asking yourself, well, what makes these three separate species? Well, there's a lot of ways to classify a species, but the one we're going to use, which many biologists use, is the ability to reproduce with each other. If you belong to a group of organisms that are similar enough to reproduce and create fertile offspring, then you're the same species. So the process of speciation involves reproductive barriers. And there's a couple types of reproductive barriers, but what they have in common is that they prevent organisms from reproducing with each other. And this is key to speciation. Now, some reproductive barriers are pre-zygotic, and what that means is these barriers prevent the egg and the sperm from two different organisms from ever meeting and forming a zygote. A zygote is just a fancy term for a fertilized egg. Some barriers, however, are post-zygotic, meaning the egg and the sperm from two different species meet, but then something happens to the zygote. It might not develop properly, or its offspring might not be able to reproduce. Let's take a look at some examples of reproductive barriers. One is habitat isolation. This is a pre-zygotic barrier. What happens is that two species who might be really similar live in different areas, and thus they never meet and never have a chance to reproduce. The egg and the sperm can never get together. Temporal isolation is similar. It's also pre-zygotic, but what happens here is that you have two species, and they may look very, very similar, but they reproduce at different times of the year. So again, the egg and the sperm never have an opportunity to meet. Mechanical isolation is very interesting. In the case of these two snails, these are two different species of snails, and you're probably thinking they look a lot alike, but their genital openings, which are shown here and here, are on opposite sides because this shell spirals in this direction, whereas this shell spirals in this direction. And as a result, the genital openings can't line up, and so the egg and the sperm can't meet. So this is a structural difference that prevents the transfer of the sperm to the egg. Behavioral isolation is another pre-zygotic mechanism. This is where two different species aren't attracted to each other, so they don't even try to mate. And this happens in the case of the blue-footed boobies. Their blue feet attract each other, and their little dance attracts each other, but it might not attract a different bird species. Now we've got a couple of post-zygotic barriers. In this case, reduced hybrid viability means that the two species do reproduce, but unfortunately the offspring die young. Similarly, in reduced hybrid fertility, the two different species reproduce. The offspring survives, but the offspring itself is infertile, and this happens in the case of horses and donkeys. Horses and donkeys can reproduce. They produce mules, and the mules can grow up and be nice and healthy, but the mules themselves are sterile. Thus, horses and donkeys are considered separate species because they've got this reproductive barrier. All right, so now that we know the types of barriers that separate species, let's take a look at how the process occurs. Now, there's a few different types of speciation, but in the type we focus on today, it all starts with geographic isolation. Here we've got a population of beetles, and something happens in the environment to physically separate the populations into two different populations. So that physical barrier could be a number of things. It could be a mountain, it could be a ravine, it could be a river. Something, though, that prevents them from interacting. And what will happen next is, if the two environments that the populations are in are different, natural selection is going to happen in different ways. The traits that are adaptive in this environment might not be the traits that are adaptive in this environment. So over time, these populations are going to start to change. And that leads to the second step, which is reproductive isolation. Here you can see that over a long period of time, that's implied by the arrow, this population has a higher percentage of green beetles, and this population has a higher percentage of brown beetles, and that might reflect different habitats. And what's happened now is that even if they are reunited, they have become so different that they can't reproduce. Some sort of reproductive barrier has emerged. Maybe it's a courtship issue. These brown beetles don't find the green beetles attractive. Maybe there's a difference in their structure that would prevent them from mating, even if they tried. But once you have reproductive isolation, once you have a reproductive barrier, you've now got two separate species. And here's an example of speciation between two chipmunks. A long time ago, the chipmunk population was separated by this ravine. And because the environments were different, had different selecting agents, the population diverged. And now we've got these two different species of chipmunk. Now, how quickly does this happen? Well, there's a couple different types of rates at which speciation can occur. The first type is known as punctuated equilibrium, and it's shown here in this phylogenetic tree. Here's the common ancestor species. Now, you can see that it speciates rather suddenly, and then there's no change for a long period of time. So the equilibrium gets at the period of little change, and the punctuated gets at the random and abrupt change. And this is often supported by fossil records, where we see gaps with no change in the species, and then the emergence of a new species a little bit later. The other type of model is gradualism. And in gradualism, a species may change very, very slowly over time. So here is the ancestral species. And here are some transitional species. They may not be fully separate species yet, but differences are slowly accumulating. And then we have, at the end, two separate species. And the evidence happens for this in the form of transitional fossils in the fossil record. Species that share traits with the common ancestor, but also the existing species, but may not have differences enough to constitute their own species. So let's take a look at extinction, which is the opposite of speciation. Extinction is the loss of a species. And it's sad to think, but most species that ever lived have gone extinct. 99% are no longer around. So the millions of species we have today are really just 1% of anything that ever existed. Now, how has this happened over time? Well, if you look at this graph, you can see that extinction has been happening the whole time. But sometimes the rates are different. Sometimes extinction rates are low, but then we have these periods where there were mass extinctions, and over 50% of species were lost. So although extinction happens all the time, the rate may vary. And these mass extinctions were caused by major environmental changes, such as volcanic eruptions, asteroids colliding with the Earth, climate change like ice ages, or continental drift. Pangea resulted in a lot of extinctions several million years ago. Now, there is a silver lining to extinction, and that is something called adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is when you have one common ancestor species that diverges into many species, not just two. And the reason this may happen is if the environment has a lot of resources and very little competition. This allows the divergence of one species into many because there's many different resources that organisms are adapted to. And when an extinction occurs, basically a lot of resources become available because all of the species are gone. Now, there's a special term that we use to describe the resources that a species uses, and that's its niche. So essentially what a mass extinction does is it opens up niches or resources for organisms. However, I'm going to end this video on kind of a down note. Many scientists believe that we are in the middle of a sixth mass extinction. If you take a look at the number of extinctions that have occurred in the last couple hundred years, it's pretty drastic. In fact, scientists think that the current extinction rate could be as much as 1,000 times more than the rate we've seen in the past in the fossil record. And unfortunately, the extinction rate is due to us. Human habitat destruction and climate change are largely to blame for the extinction rate. So it's important moving forward to use our knowledge of speciation and extinction to counteract the current sixth mass extinction that's underway.